I'm no Lynch, the membership officer for the London Green Party, formerly coordinator. It's been a busy time. We passed 10,000 members last Monday, so it's been a busy day today to you, but that was different. So we really have the chairs in. So our next speaker up, I had him last night speaking as well, and this is from my own borough, Barnet or Hendon, Danham. That you introduce yourself and say anything. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Dan Ozarow. I'm a lecturer at Middlesex University and also an activist with Jubilee Debt Campaign. So I'm going to be talking about the unregulated international debt system. I'm going to make references, I'm going to be focusing on Argentina and its recent battle with the Vulture funds, but I'm also going to be, because of the times that we're living in, making references to the Greek situation, the Greek debt crisis as well. So I think as we sit in the room this evening, the issue of national debt crisis, which is traditionally thought of as something that happens in far-off lands, in Latin America, in Africa, and so on, is currently sending shockwaves through the heart of Europe itself, including here in the United Kingdom. And until this morning, when the Eurogroup finance ministers backed Greece's reform plan, there was quite a distinct possibility that possibly as early as next week, the Greek banks could have run dry and collapsed, which could have sparked chaos and unrest in that country. Despite the 4-month stay of execution that's been granted to Greece, it may still be forced to declare a debt default and possibly exit the euro in June. This could then destabilise Europe's financial markets, and I'm sure we've all read about that recently. So, rather than simply existing as a problem for developing countries, clearly now debt crisis is now a problem for us here and now as well. So bearing in mind that the government's austerity measures that millions are suffering from today in the UK trace their origins back to the 2007 subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, along of course with our own banks and financial institutions' orgy of speculation in property investments, I want to focus this evening on the global debt system and the lack of regulation within it, and that's brought us here to this situation, and more specifically focus on a very particular element of it, one of the most grotesque facets of international finance capitalism, speculation on national debts by so-called vulture funds. I'll be describing the specifics of the court case that took place recently between a handful of wealthy billionaire speculators and the Argentinian government, in what the Financial Times has described as the sovereign debt trial of the century. I'll also explain the ramifications of the ruling, including the impact on Greece, and will suggest that in order to end the perpetual cycles of debt crisis and dependence here and in the global south, we must not only outlaw speculative practices themselves, but also go further than that and actually challenge the legitimacy of the debts themselves, so as to give sovereign governments the ability to put their interests of their own people once again before those of corporations. So how do vulture funds work? Well, the term vulture fund refers to a hedge fund that buys up the bonds of countries that are facing debt defaults, taking advantage of political and economic crises that happen in those countries when the bond prices collapse and can be bought up for for kind of a few cents on the dollar of their nominal value. They do this with the intention of holding out or waiting until the debt restructuring process takes place. Then they go and sue the debtor country for the original bond amount plus penalty fees plus interest. So they make exorbitant profits in the process, often to the tune of tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. And there are two important points to make here. The first one is that because the bonds are purchased on secondary markets, the countries themselves usually don't have control over who the bonds are sold on to. The second point is that these vulture funds often target developing countries which are in crisis. They've even been known to track, and this is really disgusting, they've been known to track debt relief process of the poorest countries in the world that are about to receive debt relief. And then what they do is they sue the country after it's received the windfall of debt cancellation, going to the courts and saying, look, they can afford to pay us now. It's really quite obscene, the kind of practices that they engage in. And this has happened in Peru, this has happened in Liberia, this has happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's happened in Cameroon. Incredibly, despite the fact that the actions of these vultures are literally causing hundreds of thousands of deaths due to the money that they deprive, the hundreds of millions of dollars they deprive developing countries of in terms of spending on health programs or fighting disease and famine, the practices are completely legal and there is very little regulation to prevent them. Now, earlier I mentioned I was going to talk about Greece. The vulture funds do not simply act in developing countries. They target any country where there is distressed debt, including members of the European Union. So there's a vulture fund called DART that has made 250 million euros a profit on the Greek debt after the 2012 debt haircuts there. And I don't know how many of you in the room have got accounts with the co-op. I imagine a few of you have. Well, you probably remember in 2013, Aurelius, which is one of the two hedge funds, vulture funds that are attacking Argentina, invested in the co-op and forced it to demutualise. So clearly there are ramifications here in Britain directly for those of us who are account holders as well. So what exactly happened in Argentina? Well, to understand this we need to go back to 2001. Following a decade of neoliberal reforms and the accumulation of enormous trade deficits in the 1990s, Argentina was forced to commit the largest ever national debt default in history to the tune of $81 billion. Its economy crashed through the floor, GDP fell by 20%, a quarter of the population were left unemployed, and poverty reached 54%. Around this time, a number of hedge funds bought up some of the debt at bargain prices in the form of bonds, and they paid just 20 cents on the dollar for the value of what the bonds were worth, essentially speculating on the misery of millions of Argentinian people in order to make profit later on. Around this time, a number of hedge funds, in the years that followed, tough negotiations took place between the Argentinian government, the left-leaning government of President Néstor Kirchner, and then his wife, Cristina, and 93% of the country's creditors agreed to write off 2/3 of the value of the Argentinian debt. Partly thanks to this, Argentina became the fastest growing economy in the Western Hemisphere, and 11 million people were lifted out of poverty. So in the Argentinian case, debt default was proven to be the right thing to do despite the initial pain that it caused. Now, the problem was that a small number of Argentina's creditors, the vulture funds, NML and Aurelius, refused to agree to the debt write-downs, even though they would have still made hundreds of millions of dollars of profit. Instead, they decided to sue Argentina for the full amount of the original bond value, which would have equated to 1,400% profit. In recent years, the vultures did everything they could to bully and harass Argentina into giving in. For example, they tried to get Argentina thrown out of the G20, they lobbied the World Bank to stop them providing new loans, and they even established a lobby group called American Task Force Argentina to argue their case in the corridors of power in Washington, and which has now spent $4 million persuading US congressmen to support their cause. So, rolling the clock forward to August 2013, a judge at a court in New York, where the bonds were originally issued, ruled that Argentina must pay $1.3 billion to Aurelius and NML. That's to say, the current debt value plus the penalty fees plus the interest accrued. The US Supreme Court supported the original ruling, but the Argentinian government refused to comply and refused to pay the vultures. Now you might ask why. $1.3 billion is obviously a lot of money, but to a country like Argentina, which is in the G20 with reserves of $30 billion, it's affordable. Well, first of all, the current president, Cristina Kirchner, has rhetorically taken a very firm stance against the vultures. She follows a quite nationalistic policy platform. Secondly, and more importantly, paying the vultures, and I'm going to use a bit of legal terminology here, I'm afraid, paying the vultures would have activated what is known as the Pari Passu clause. Has anyone heard of that before? One or two nods, okay. That's better than other audiences have had. Well, this is a standard part of almost all international borrowing by governments. meaning that all creditors must be treated under equal terms to all the others. However, according to Judge Thomas Gresser, his specific interpretation of the clause was that if Argentina made any more payments to those bondholders that had restructured their debt, it would also have to pay the vulture funds back in full, i.e. the 100% of the debt, the bond value originally. Now, because of another clause, which is called RUFO, which is rights upon future offers, stay with me because I'm going to summarise it in a second, if the Argentinian government subsequently negotiated more favourable terms with NML or Aurelius, then it would have to offer the bondholders exactly the same deal. Okay? So, summarising what this means, if NML and Aurelius were subsequently paid in full, then the 93% of bondholders that had their terms restructured and only paid a third of the value of the bond, of the original bond value, would also have to be paid in full, right? So what that would mean is that it would leave the Argentinian state with an insurmountable bill of perhaps $100 billion, which would have caused a crisis on the scale of 2001 again. So it simply could not do that. Now, the judicial proceedings themselves were wrought with allegations of nepotism, abuse of authority, and a lack of judicial independence. Let's take the judge, for instance, Thomas Gresser, lifelong Republican, appointed by President Nixon in the 1970s, but he was presiding over a case brought by Paul Singer, the CEO of NML, who also happened to be one of the largest Republican Party donors. So many also claim that the judge acted illegally, moving beyond his jurisdiction by effectively overriding Argentina's 2005 and 2010 debt swaps and restructuring with the bondholders, which had been contractually agreed between them, and the judge just said, no, I'm overriding them. It's not actually possible to do that. Things came to a head in June 2013 when Gresser embargoed a scheduled $539 million interest payment that Argentina tried to make to its restructured debt holders until the vultures were already paid. This triggered a kind of Kafkaesque scenario under which, on the 31st of July 2014, credit agencies dubiously declared Argentina to be in default once again, even though, in contrast to Standard & Poor's own criteria about what constitutes a debt default, Argentina had both the financial ability to make the payment, because remember they've got $30 billion dollars of currency reserves, and showed its willingness to pay as well, because it actually ordered its bank to make the payment to the 93% of restructured bondholders. To this day, the Argentinian government has refused to pay a penny to the vulture funds, even after the RUFO clause expired on the 1st of January, which meant that it had more freedom to negotiate with the vultures without enacting the clause that means that we have to pay 100% to the remaining 93%. So what are the global repercussions of this ruling? Well, first of all, it set a legal precedent under which the rights of a handful of wealthy billionaire speculators to make enormous profits supersede those of a sovereign nation to defend its people under international law. Secondly, future debt restructurings by crisis-ridden countries may become impossible because hedge funds will no longer have any incentive to write off national debts owed to them. They now know that they can just find a judge in a Western-friendly country, go to them and have him rule that the full amount should be paid, citing the Argentina case. Countries in the global south could be condemned to generations of austerity as the only way of affording repayment in the absence of the possibility of debt restructuring. Now, Argentina's problems today could well become Europe's problems tomorrow. Hedge funds are already buying up Greek debt at something like 50% of their original value, and they stand to make a lot of money if Greece ends up defaulting. Thirdly, I can at least deliver some kind of message of hope to you, because the international solidarity that Argentina received and that the case itself has generated has led to the emergence of a new global consensus on the need to rewrite the rules of sovereign debt restructuring. In September 2014, the G77 nations, plus China, plus the BRIC countries, plus the South American countries of UNASUR, overwhelmingly forced through a resolution to the UN General Assembly to create a multilateral legal framework for the sovereign debt restructuring process for the first time. This could prevent vulture funds from blocking future debt restructurings. Shamefully, I have to tell you, friends, that the British government, George Osborne, Danny Alexander included in the delegation, were one of only 11 countries to have voted against this proposal. We all have to say boo to that. Meanwhile, back in the UK, a tremendous degree of solidarity has been expressed. For example, Jubilee Debt Campaign helped to gather the support of 106 MPs for an EDM which was sponsored by Caroline Lucas. Hooray? Okay. Expressing their opposition to vulture funds' exploitation of Argentina and Greece. Several thousand British residents also signed a petition, which you can find on the Jubilee Debt Campaign website, and 2 protests were organised outside NML's offices in London. Yet while in 2010 Jubilee successfully encouraged the British Parliament to approve a landmark law that restricts vulture funds from suing the poorest 44 countries in UK courts, the reality is that international finance capitalism has remained almost entirely unregulated. The vultures' growing lobbying power over elected representatives and in the media mean that their potential to inflict political damage on opponents leaves ever few regulatory checks and balances available. So neither President Obama, for example, nor the US Congress have been brave enough to enact similar legislation to that we have in Britain. So outlawing the vulture's speculative practices on its own, this is the key argument I want to make, will not resolve the problem of perpetual debt crises and dependency, either for Argentina or other countries in the global south or those here in Europe, unless there are fundamental transformations in terms of how the global debt system functions. Whilst several African and Latin American nations have quite rightly sought to break free from dependency on Western financial institutions such as the IMF, alternative funding sources offer little hope. So, for example, many countries in Africa, Latin America and Southeast Asia are developing closer ties with China. Huge investments from China, huge loans from China, but although the terms are marginally better than they are from the IMF, it's simply going to duplicate cycles, relationships of dependency. The other option people have pointed to is the new BRICS Development Bank as a source of fairer development funding. However, details are emerging about the arrangements, the borrowing arrangements of the bank, and it appears that they would leave debtor countries with very little room for manoeuvre to escape neoliberalism's financial infrastructure. So, for example, they require an on-track agreement with the IMF in order to qualify themselves for financial assistance. So the BRICS Bank, I'm afraid, is not going to be the kind of counter-hegemonic financial lender that people were hoping it would be. Nor is the status quo acceptable, of course, because IMF loan programmes and aid conditionality are meaning that countries like Ghana, that originally benefited from huge debt cancellation in 2005, are heading back to high debt payments. Indeed, since the debt jubilee of 2000, there's been something like $130 billion of external debt cancellation, but it's almost always entailed conditions such as the privatisation of state-owned enterprises. So Greece's 2012 debt haircut gives us another example of how this has happened. It involved part cancellation of debt, but on the creditor's terms, not on the Greek government's terms. So it entailed even deeper austerity and even higher, longer-term interest payments. It's worth, because of the crowd here, it's worth adding a few words on the environment. The impact on the environment of the existing global debt system. When countries in the global south have large debts, the conditionality attached to them means that in order to receive new loans from the World Bank or from the Paris Club, traditionally it's forced them to open up their agricultural industries or their extractive industries to corporations such as Monsanto, such as Chevron, who come in, exploit their natural resources, pollute the land, drilling for oil, and those kinds of things. Partly due to high debt burdens, neo-extractivism is actually enjoying a resurgence as an economic model in these countries. Because, quite simply, it's the only alternative source of revenues they have to pay for their social welfare programs. So, trying to tie things up, what alternative is it that Jubilee Debt Campaign and myself are appealing for here? Well, our proposal is that the legitimacy of the debts themselves need to be confronted. through public debt audits in order as a kind of mechanism to emancipate citizens from the burden of debt dependence and so as to regain national sovereignty. An elected commission would kind of open up the national accounts, trace the origins of the debts so that the amount that can be deemed illegitimate can be determined and then not paid. How and why are debts illegitimate, you might ask? Well, this varies from country to country. So in Argentina's case, the Judge Ballestero in the 2000 Olmos cause ruled that a large part of the debt originates back to the period of military dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, when, in violation of its own constitution, Argentina sought loans from the IMF, the Paris Club and so on in international markets to fund the military dictatorship that murdered and disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens. The banks that lent to them often did so contravening their own legal counsel, who advised them of the illegality of such loans. The interest payments on this debt have since been recycled time and time again for the last 30 years, meaning that a significant part of today's debt can be traced back to these origins. Indeed, aside from being odious, the Judge Ballestero also found that there were 477 cases, separate acts of fraud and arbitrary acts which contributed towards this debt accumulating, including several which entailed the nationalisation of private debt corporations. So the verdict itself brought into question the legality of the debt, not just the illegitimacy of the debt as well. Just some final words on Greece and the debt legitimacy there. So I'm sure that you've noticed that in the last few weeks, months, even a couple of years, despite the wall-to-wall coverage of the Greek debt crisis, we've hardly ever heard anything about questions of illegitimacy of the Greek state debt. However, if one dissects the history of the debt in Greece, it becomes clear that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it needs to be investigated and partly cancelled. Firstly, during World War II, an occupation loan of 400 million marks that Greece was forced to provide to Hitler for military armaments grossly expanded Greece's debt at the time. Notably, when the war reparations happened from Germany to the Allies, this loan that was made was not included in it. So it remains part of Greece's debts today, because the debt origins have also been recycled countless times. Then there's the question of Greece's own dictatorship between 1967 and 74. The kind of debts that were accrued then obviously qualify as odious debt. More recently, the colossal debt incurred for the organisation of the Olympic Games in 2004 was partly accrued due to alleged bribes made by multinationals so as to obtain contracts for the Games. So for instance, Siemens allegedly bribed officials to win a contract from Hellenic Telecom and for a new security system for the Athens Olympics. In 2011, a Greek parliamentary committee sent a letter to Siemens claiming that the total damage to the economy as a result of these amounted to 2 billion euros. The company rejected these claims. Now, demands for a public debt audit in Greece grew very strongly and were actually made by none other than Alexis Tsipras, the current Prime Minister of Greece, and Syriza's leader. But today, this has slipped out of discourse. It's slipped out of public discourse. The left of Syriza is still arguing for it. The leadership has taken a different position. We can discuss reasons for that afterwards. So just very final words. How realistic, we've spoken about public debt audits, but how realistic is the proposal to conduct public debt audits into the legitimacy of these debts? Well, the important point to make is that these audits have already been performed by several countries, actually. These countries have not only survived non-payment of the proportion of the debt that's deemed to be illegitimate, but they've actually thrived and boast thriving economies today. For instance, in 2008, Ecuador's President Correa established a commission that found that 70% of its debt was illegitimate through partly defaulting, refusing to pay, and partly selectively buying back bonds. The country's debt burden was slashed by $7 billion, which is a huge amount of money in a country like Ecuador. Today, Ecuador is one of the fastest growing economies in the region. However, it's not just countries in the global south which either possess illegitimate debts or have sought to audit them. The government of Norway has conducted an audit into debts owed to it and cancelled debts arising from loans for exports which were known to be damaging at the time they were given have been written off, have been cancelled. Even in France, a citizen's debt audit established 60% of the French debt is illegitimate for different reasons. Now, it hasn't been instituted by the government, but at least the audit has been done. Public audits are feasible, and refusing to pay does not mean financial Armageddon. Further, because hedge funds they're not like shareholder companies. They're basically, they're kind of small groups of multi-millionaire fund executives. Any debt cancellation that results as a result will the harm, if you like, caused by financial harm will largely be confined to those people alone. Meanwhile, the benefits of job creation, economic growth, equality and welfare and poverty reduction that result will surely be unimaginable after that. So debt audits in Argentina and across the world, I would argue, are worth a try, because we have, quite frankly, nothing to lose but our debt chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel has actually just lately been elected as Baroness Green Party's trade union liaison officer. We have an extra speaker before you.
Oh, you do? Good. Does that mean I'll go home?
No, it means you've got 5 minutes, to, more or less. Where are you? Oh, yeah, yeah.